I'm going to ask a question. How many of you have heard of, have read about 80-20 training, polarized training, the things that I've worked with? Okay. So that's what I was hoping, that it's not completely foreign to the crowd, because I don't want to have to, let's see if this is working. No? Is it on? Now it's on. Thanks. I'm not going to take you through the entire history of 25 years of research on this area, because I want us to move forward. I want us to look at new things. But I do want to at least say briefly my approach to doing research in this area, because some of you are students and scientists and so forth. My training was in physiology. My master's and PhD work was in very basic physiology, so I was actually making rats run on treadmills. I was studying their hearts, so I've done that kind of research and published that kind of research. And then at the same time, I was a subject in many studies. I was watching research on humans. Even Lance Armstrong was in the laboratory next to me. So I've always tried to mix cellular mechanistic kinds of approaches with more systemic human body studies. So when I moved to Norway, I quickly discovered that the lab studies that I had been trained with didn't necessarily tell an accurate story about how the training process actually worked in high-performance environments, because we weren't studying high-performance athletes in the laboratory. We were studying mostly untrained people, or very modestly trained. So one of the key issues was to go out and actually measure, quantify how the best athletes were training, because over many decades, athletes and their coaches, many of you, represent a kind of laboratory where the training process evolves over time. And the scientists had to catch up with that. Of course, then I was lucky enough to be able to study different sports, because I didn't want to just study running or just study swimming or just study skiing. I wanted to look for, are there universal rules or self-organizing principles that emerge from this process. And then we could take the knowledge we learn from these descriptive and sometimes somewhat quasi-experimental studies and design studies for the laboratory, but then we have to study, I'll call them sub-elites, because the top athletes don't come into the laboratory. They don't very often allow you to manipulate, to change what they do. And then, of course, we have, or at least I believe, we have to connect the best practice that we are seeing out in the field and try to understand it in the light of what we're learning from molecular biology, from systems physiology, and see where do these match up and where do they not. And then finally, I think something that's happening today in the time we live with our digital platforms, our technology, is that whereas when I first started studying athletes, studying physiology, a sample size of 10 was good. Now, if I go to talk to the owner of Training Peaks, he tells me that they are collecting 10 million training sessions digitally every month. Now that was a year ago, so that number is probably larger now. So we have access to an amount of data of varying degrees of quality that we've never had access to before, and this crowdsourced data can be data from some of you as athletes that are putting your data out there. It can be a source of information about optimization of the training process. Or it can just confuse the heck out of us, depending on how we learn to work with it. So just to very quickly summarize, I guess this is the paper that came out that I published back in 2006, where we this was kind of the money picture. The main point is that we said it looks like high-performance endurance athletes train a lot below the first lactate turn point at low intensity. If you give them some colors, they train a lot in the green zone. They train some in the red zone and some in the yellow zone, but all in all about 80% low intensity, 20% upper intensities, threshold and higher. And this was very different than what was in the literature based on untrained athletes or untrained people. And with untrained, you see that they train at their lactate threshold for 6 weeks and they get better. But then we never keep following them after 6 weeks. And then a few years ago in 14, Stogel and Spierlich, they took a little bit of issue with the polarized definition and said, well, yeah, it's true that almost all the studies we see that the athletes are training mostly at low intensity, but the distribution of the threshold versus high intensity, it does vary. Some athletes are training more threshold and less high intensity, and some the opposite. But what they have in common, all of these studies show about 80% of the training volume measured in training sessions is below the first lactate turn point. Now, I know you, unless you have amazing eyes, you cannot see the writing here, but what you can know is that the black bars represent low intensity, the gray is threshold, and the white is high intensity. So you can get a feeling for the overall, all of these different studies, either in the preparation period or the pre-competition period. The picture is quite similar. Now, this is a recent study from Spain. Again, I wish you could see better, but I will just tell you that it's an underpowered study. Typically in sports science, that we don't have good enough sample sizes, but this is 6 athletes training for the half Ironman using a polarized approach, and 7 athletes using what they call a pyramidal approach, meaning more threshold training, more threshold intensity work, versus more of a polarized approach. So both groups train about 80% low intensity, but one of the groups trained more threshold, one trained more, you might say, interval training. And then the question is, well, which group did best in the half Ironman? And the answer was, it was absolutely no difference. And I think this may be an important point, is that it seems to me after 20 years of looking at this that one of the key success factors is just getting the basic distribution right. Meaning that we cannot push too much of the training over into that upper threshold and high intensity range. That's when we start seeing problems. But as long as the athletes are doing a lot of work below the first threshold, how we organize that high intensity work, and I'm going to call threshold and interval training, that's all high intensity work, that is probably individual and probably distance specific, somewhat related to the distance they're performing. A rower rowing 6 minutes versus a half Ironman 4 hours versus a full Ironman 8 hours, it's not difficult to see that there would be different focus on some of the high intensity training. Whoops. I just want to show this because, again, you can't read it, but I get this question a lot, so I'm going to go ahead and clarify. The typical question related to the so-called 80-20 model is 80% what? Is it 80% of training kilometers or hours? Is it 80% of training sessions? And the original research, the work that we presented years ago, was based on training sessions, meaning about 8 out of every 10 training sessions were at low intensity. But we've done very careful comparisons with high performance athletes at training camps, and if you use their heart data, and they're training 8 out of 10 sessions at low intensity, then their heart data will say that they're training about 90% of the time in zone at low intensity. So it depends on how you use, which system you use, whether you use a category system or a heart rate based time in zone system or something in between. Now, is this important? Well, probably so when you're working with high performance athletes, because that can be 100 hours difference in total training time, or at the high intensity range it could be 30 or 40 hours of training difference over the course of a year, depending on how you are quantifying things and how you're comparing and speaking with each other about your training distribution. So it's important to be consistent. This woman was asking me, she's a Great Britain age group national champion, and she says, hey, I'm training 5 days a week, 4 easy, 1 hard. Do I need to be training 2 days a week hard? And I said, well, no, 80-20 is about what you're doing. It seems to be working quite well. Keep doing it. And she writes back, oh, good. I don't want to have to train 2 days a week hard because it doesn't work very well for me. It's too much. So it's good to be able to solve that problem for her. She seems to be doing quite well. All right, so if you use your heart rate data, I have mine. Here's a typical scenario. You do a workout like this. In this case, it's 5 times 8 minutes, high intensity. This was a cross-country skier on the national team. Very good. So the blood lactates in this case are pretty low relative to the intensity, but they're elite performers with 80 plus mLs per kg and about 85% slow twitch fibers. Now the question is, how do we quantify this training session? One way would be just the classic time and zone, and the program will, as you know, you put in your zones and it will quantify how many seconds in every zone, right? Time and zone. That's the squiggly line. Another approach, the approach that's used by most Norwegian athletes, is they say, well, my workout was 5 times 8 minutes. That's 40 minutes of high intensity work. Heart rate takes a while to catch up, but my high intensity work is actually 40 minutes, even though the heart rate says 28. So they square off the times, and we call that a modified time and zone. And then the third way is just to say, well, this entire session was hard. There was a warm-up period, but the main part of the session was interval training. So we're going to put this whole session in the high-intensity box and say that today was a hard day. Tomorrow's an easy day. So those are 3 different ways of quantifying your athlete's training. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but you need to be careful. You need to be consistent and make sure that when you're speaking with someone else that says, well, we're doing 80%, and you say, well, I'm at 90% low intensity, make sure you're actually using the same quantification methods, because it does make a difference, and I'll show you later. Now, I want to just show this, because I suspect there are different kinds of athletes in the room, coaches of different sports, and it's really important that we are careful when we start to compare sports and talk about training volume, training time. And this is an example from rowing versus running. And a rower may be able to do a 25 to 30 hour training week. And the rower is never loaded unless they're doing strength training. They're doing no eccentric work. They're doing no ballistic loading. Just this concentric pull. And they can tolerate big hours as long as their back doesn't get injured. The runner, if you go through the math and you calculate the load on the legs, it may be 30 times higher if you just measure forces on the legs for the runner versus the rower. And you will never see an elite distance runner running 25 or 30 hours in a week. At least not for more than a week. And so there are big differences in training volume. And therefore, my point to you is, do not try to compare apples and oranges. If you look across sports, if you look at training hours,
si nos fijamos en las horas de entrenamiento,
may be at 550 to 600 hours of training in a year, if you just count hours. And the swimmers, the triathletes, the cyclists that have a lot more work without eccentric, without ballistic, they may be at twice the workload measured in hours. But there's no point in trying to compare and say, the distance runners are lazy. That's wrong. Now, here's data from rowers. This is world-class juniors we published on a few years ago. And for the rowers, 95% of their training time based on time in zone, heart rate, was low intensity. Now, these were world champion juniors from Germany. And 95% of their time was in the green zone. This is one of the all-time great cross-country skiers from Norway. She's been retired for a number of years now, but she was multiple world champion, Olympic gold medalist. This is her entire career, quantified by a guy from Olympiatoppen named Espen Tønnesen. So you're looking, each bar represents 1 year of training. That's about 8,000 training sessions that are summarized in that one slide, which is quite a job to digitize all of the training diaries and testing. The numbers in parentheses are the VO2 max values each year. And I think you see the dominance of the low intensity component. And in this particular athlete, you actually can see that when this athlete started training higher volume, moving the volume up from about 500-600 hours to 800-900 hours, without a change in high intensity work here, this is when her VO2 max reached what we would call world-class level in cross-country skiing. So we've published studies and worked with skiers, distance runners, cyclists, rowers. I haven't looked at swimmers, but I know Inigo has a lot of research on swimming. And the basic story is the same for all of these different groups, that there are some general self-organizing principles related to this distribution issue. And even if you look at across the spectrum of performance level, generally you see that through a very broad range, as training volume goes up, performance velocity goes up, running speed. So this is the average for 5K, 10K, half marathon, marathon. This is in miles, so 60 miles is about 100 kilometers. And at least through 100 kilometers a week, it's just very clear downward relationship. The more you run, the faster you run. Now this is cross-sectional data. But here's some data. This was not published. This was from a master's thesis at my university while I was a university leader. Should have been published, I would say. But they were able to recruit a group of 47 runners preparing for a marathon. 11 of them were in the sub 230 category. They were sub 230 marathon runners. 22 of them were sub 3 hours, so between 2:30 and 3 hour marathoners. And then 14 of them were 3 hour to 3:30 marathoners. Now, to put this in perspective, if you look at data from Berlin, New York Marathon, Chicago, and so forth, if you're a sub 2:30 marathoner, you're in the top 0.3% of all the marathoners for men. So that's very good. I won't say elite, but it's a very good time on a population basis. If you're sub 3, you're in the top 3%. So here's the basic. This was the average time for each group: 2:24, 2:48, and 3:18. The average distance they ran was about 160 kilometers, 90 kilometers, or 60 kilometers per week. So that's pretty typical of what we see for these different performance levels. And if you count hours, then the 224 marathoners were running about 12 hours a week. The 3 hour and 18 minute were running about half of that, 6.5 hours per week in just duration. But here's where things get interesting. Let's look at how they distribute their intensity.
When we looked at their data in terms of...
When we looked at their data in terms of 3 intensity zones, low intensity runs below the first threshold, threshold sessions, and high intensity sessions, and then just for reference, this is the actual pace in the marathon for these groups. All right, so these guys averaged 324. They ran between 217 and 229, and 359 per kilometer here, 442 per kilometer here. So this gives you a reference. And then here's their average speed for low intensity runs, for threshold runs, and for high intensity runs. This is in kilometers per hour and in minutes per kilometer. So one of those will make sense to you. Now, when you look at this as relative to their actual marathon speed, here's what it looks like. The fastest runners train actually at the lowest intensity across the spectrum relative to their actual marathon intensity. Does this make sense? So when they're running low intensity sessions, they're running on average at about 85% of marathon pace. When they're running a threshold session, they're almost right at marathon pace. And when they're doing a high intensity session, they are above marathon pace, but not terribly far. In fact, that's about 5K pace based on research, about 13% difference between a 5K and a marathon pace at world-class level. Exactly 13%. Now, when you look at the athletes that are training less volume, these athletes are training about 10 to 11 sessions per week. So they're doing twice-a-day workouts on 3 or 4 days of the week. But when you go down to this group, they're training every day, but only once a day. And their low-intensity sessions are harder. Their threshold sessions are actually well above marathon pace. And then they're killing themselves on the high-intensity sessions. And then when you go down to the 60-kilometer-a-week athletes, they are at marathon pace or higher all the time. They don't run easy. And when they're doing a threshold session, they're basically at high intensity. And here, I don't know what this is, but I'm pretty sure if we measured their blood lactate, it would be way up there. And this we see as a typical scenario. The high-performance athletes distribute their intensity much differently than a lot of the athletes you're working with that are very hungry to get better, but they're trying to get better by intensifying their work instead of extending their work. Now, this is a study from a few years ago where they compared weekend warriors. We call them weekend warriors, these people who just train on the weekend. They don't have time, they're working all week. And then on Saturday and Sunday, they load it up. And they train, in this case, they train 75 minutes on Saturday and 75 minutes on Sunday. And then they didn't do anything from Monday to Friday. This was the third group. And then they compared them with a group, that's the second group. And this group ran 5 days a week, but only for 30 minutes. That's your typical, I got to get out there, give it a good effort, but I don't have much time. And then the third group was couch potatoes. So which of these, I figure the couch potatoes didn't do so well, but which gave a better training effect? Just 2 days a week, back to back, longer, or 5 days a week for 30 minutes? Who votes 5 days a week? Who votes 2 days a week, weekend warriors? No one votes. One guy. He knows the plot here. To be honest, it didn't matter. It was the same. Now, I think that's pretty fascinating because it's pretty, in some ways, consistent with what the high-performance athletes do. What do? They do a lot longer sessions. Now, they don't wait 5 days, they do also work all 5 days, but they do these low intensity day after day, and it turns out that that gives a pretty good training effect in this group of weekend warriors. It actually works, but you have to go longer than 30 minutes. At least this is what this data shows. And this came out on Twitter. I have a Twitter account, and this guy said, you know, we talk a lot about high-intensity training and threshold training, but we don't talk very much about how we organize, how we plan all that 80% of the work we do. We talk about the 20% all the time. Is there a way to optimize the 80%? And so he just threw out these different, you know, here it might be a traditional way of just doing, you know, mostly easy work, mostly at a moderate amount of volume, versus here kind of a block loading of low intensity training. Does that give a better effect? We don't know, but this is a good question. And this is kind of where I want us to go today. Now, if we, as a medical, trained in a kind of a medically oriented field, we know about dose-response relationships. This is how you study drug effects. If you're going to give high blood pressure medicine, you try to find the appropriate dose that gives a very positive effect, but doesn't have a high risk of side effects. And this is dose-response studies are done in any kind of drug that you might take, or your grandparents or whatever, for some illness. Well, it's kind of similar in training. Is if we want to find the level of training load that gives the highest degree of positive effects with minimum risk, that's great. We can do that. But unfortunately, at least for high-performance athletes, that's not where you're at. You have to train that extra 5% and accept an increased risk of side effects. So then the question becomes, can we do things with the training load that minimize the risk of side effects, overtraining, overreaching, and so forth, while still inducing the maximum adaptations that are necessary for performance? So why so much green zone? You know, this is still a fundamental question. Why not? Why shouldn't it work to do more threshold training and less total volume? Why are the athletes approaching it this way? Why does this seem to be a self-organizing principle? And I think, at least from my perspective, there are three potential mechanisms, and they're probably interconnected. I don't think it's one or the other. But on the positive side, it does seem that that we have to be very clear that it's not just intensity that induces a signal for adaptation. It is the intensity times duration. And that means that there are different combinations of intensity and duration that can turn on cellular signals for example, mitochondrial synthesis. And the athlete can manipulate those two variables in a way that is sustainable. The other issue that often gets brought up is energy availability management. That when you train more at threshold intensity and high intensity, the glycogen depletion cost, some have argued, may make that type of training less sustainable day after day. And the third, which I think is important, is the issue of systemic stress load. That when we train at low intensity, below the first threshold, we don't turn on cortisol production, we don't turn on a big sympathetic stress response, we don't seem to turn on cytokine responses, meaning an immunosuppression response. So it seems that the athletes, I would call it, stays under the stress response radar, signaling adaptations at the cellular level in the working muscles, but not creating that daily sympathetic stress response. And we do know from research in horses and humans that if you expose humans or horses to daily, moderately high stress, then you can almost be sure they will break down. That's the recipe. is monotone, moderately high to high stress is a great recipe for overreaching and overtraining. So it seems that athletes have figured this out, and they vary the stress load from day to day. And I think that's basically what it comes down to, is trying to find this appropriate ratio between adaptive signal and systemic stress that your athlete is being exposed to. Now, you have to have days with a high systemic stress, but you just can't do it every day. So that's kind of where I'm at in my understanding of endurance training, is that I want to see if through appropriate manipulation of the training intensity distribution, how we do things, we can move this rock, this fulcrum, just a little, so that we increase this while minimizing or optimizing the stress level. Does that make sense to you? All right, a little exercise here. I don't want everybody to raise their hand and tell me, but in your mind, think, put a number to it. How many times have I trained this year? How many individual workouts have I performed? How many are at 500? Anybody at 500? How many at 300? How many at 250? I'm at 250. That's about where I'm at. Okay. Now let's do this. There's a little equation for you. And you're thinking, wait a minute, nobody told me we're going to do math today. But this is a stupid equation, but it illustrates a point. Let's say you have an athlete that is training 500 times a year. And that's not unusual in the high-performance sport. You're doing two-a-days and so forth. So 500 individual training sessions executed during a year. Triathletes, skiers, they're all doing that many. And let's say, if I asked you how big of an average physiological capacity improvement for each of those workouts would I need to get a 5% improvement on my physical capacity for the whole year. 5% is huge if you're a high-performance athlete. Well, the math tells me that it would be 0.01% per workout. You can't measure that. But that's how small the average percentage change would be. So what I want you to understand is we really have to get the helicopter up in the air to look at the overall picture of training to understand how we are inducing that in performance enhancement. It's not the 1 week. It's not the one epic interval session that brings your athlete from one performance level to that level that gets them on the podium. It's the 500 sessions and how they've all interconnected and interrelated and how healthy they've maintained. And that's a tougher perspective to see. We get focused on the one. Now, periodization. So I've talked about the big picture, looking at the helicopter, but you guys say, well, yeah, but what about the periodization model? Which model are you using? Reverse periodization or, standard periodization? There's so many different models, and here's a good periodization model. This is well established. It works perfectly for building a garage onto your house. And that's what this actually is. This is from the internet. This is a garage. If you carefully looked at it, the yellow is the landscape gardener. That's almost at the end of the process. You don't start with the landscape gardener. And so forth. But when you apply this to a biological human, they don't operate that way. We don't function linearly. And this has been nicely discussed by John Keeley. I can recommend this article to say, where does all this periodization come from? Is it evidence-based? Well, in our hands, it hasn't been evidence-based. We haven't been able to see these very distinct patterns. This is an elite champion cross-country skier. This is training hours. This is training sessions across the months of the year. This is high-intensity training sessions. And you basically don't see a lot of change from month to month. They are doing the work. This is the all-time great cross-country skier. This is from, I redrew the data, but it's from, I think, one of the best case studies that's been published on an endurance athlete. This is her 5 most successful years of performance, and she won everything that could be won in her sport, and this is her training intensity distribution. She got it right. But a few years earlier in her career, she was ready to retire because it wasn't going right. In 2005, she was world champion. She was training a lot of high intensity, at least in that context. So here, this is what she looked like in this period. Now, this is the intensity distribution. This is the high intensity component. It's basically the same, but if you actually carefully look, she was doing twice as much high-intensity work in this period where she fell apart and fell off the podium. So again, that helicopter view, the differences between ultimate success, the highest success in the history of her sport, and for her, fiasco and early retirement was not very big. It's not terribly easy to see. It's about 50 hours a year of high-intensity sessions that she couldn't tolerate. She had to reduce the high-intensity component. She increased the low-intensity component, and she found a balance that was sustainable, and she won pretty much everything in this case. So my point here is that it's not always going to be a huge difference between success and failure, or between sustainable and unsustainable for your athlete. Now here's an athlete that's not at a really high level. This is my daughter. She was a competitive dancer. She taught herself to do stuff like this, but she really didn't like dancing that much. She said, "Papa, I'm more of a dancing runner." So eventually she quit dancing after 10 years and let me be her coach, and now she's a distance runner, and so I get to put her on a treadmill and do mean things to her and stuff like that, take lactate and stuff. And she runs a 10K in 35 minutes, so she's not bad. So in about a year and a half, she's gone from 47 to 35 minutes for 10K. But I want to show you some data, because so she's more of a typical athlete. She's good, but certainly not great. This is her year that we've quantified all of her training. And I want to ask you the question, so you know the basic 5 zones here. When, across these 10 months, was this athlete performing best? 3 personal bests, half marathon and 10K. When during that cycle, the blue line is training kilometers per month. Okay, and this is the intensity distribution. So in your mind, when did she peak? Anyone want to throw up your hand and give me a number? Give me a month. This is January, this is June, this is October. Nobody wants to try? Come on, Indigo. When did she peak? That's right. Dang it, you're too good. But my point here is this is my daughter. We do a lactate profile here. She's basically training really easy here, getting back after 6 months off, and everything is going great here. And the first lactate profile is so good that I think, she'll break 35, first 10K. But then my daughter, who is a bit OCD and good is good, better, more is better, she starts pushing harder, and every interval session becomes like a race. And she pushes herself and grinds. And by the time she gets here, she is a shadow. She's a minute slower for 10K, not a minute faster. So what do we have to do? We have to put the brakes on and say, you're not allowed to go above 90% heart rate. When you hit 91, 92, we shut it down. And she recovers better. And here's where the personal bests come. 3 PBs. by easing up, by reducing the intensity of the hard sessions, not increasing. The only thing she does, she gets so much energy back, she goes crazy with the volume, and that, was a bit too much as well. And so this is typical for athletes, is they have to you have to search a little bit across the distribution. She said, I have to go across, I have to find my limit, I have to pass it, and then I come back. So that's what she did. So here's a much better runner, a world champion. This is the basic periodization, not very fancy. The basic intensity distribution stays the same. Now I'm going to hop through some of this because I want to get to something else. Monitoring training. I want to talk a little bit about some issues here. These are our 3 ways of monitoring the training of the athlete. This is it. These are the 3. We can measure power and pace directly. Power in cycling is the rage. Everyone measures power now. We can do physiological measurements, heart rate being the main window into the physiological system, but we can also measure blood lactate. And we can just ask people, how's it feel? Their perception. The brain is calculating constantly how this is feeling. Those are the 3. And right now, we're in this time where there's a lot of discussion about which one is best, which one is the right one. No, we don't need the physiology anymore because we have power. Well, that's baloney. It's bullshit. Because the power or pace is a product of the physiology. And if we're never paying attention to the physiology, then we don't know why the power goes up or down. So I think fundamentally, these 3 are a holy trinity. They need to be looked at in relation to each other. We have our basic model everyone is familiar with. You've all studied sports science. You know this is our laboratory model for VO2 max, lactate threshold, and efficiency with a little anaerobic capacity thrown in if it's a short distance race. And we know how to get all this with ventilatory measurements or lactate measurements and find our 2 thresholds, our 2 turn points. And typically in the physiological literature for training, we use 3 zones based on these 2 identifiable thresholds. Sometimes we add zones, but that's just to make things more, you might say, pedagogical when we're discussing with the athlete, to be a little bit more specific. And those are the anchor points for our zone system. These we just make up because they're not based on a specific physiological measurement, okay? And above 100%, it's blue, it's sky's the limit, anaerobic types of things. Heart rate doesn't matter. One thing to know, heart rate's pretty stable. You don't need to bring athletes into the lab 4 to 6 times a year. If you first know the heart rate at these specific lactate thresholds, that heart rate will be pretty stable. We've got 2 or 3 different studies that show that. Hopefully power or pace will increase, but at the same heart rate. So 1 lactate profile per year is probably enough, okay? Now, max heart rate, you can't see this, but this is from 100 athletes that we've studied. You need to know their actual maximum heart rate. Do not use 220 minus age. Do not use 208 minus 0.7 times age, because it may work for 100 athletes on average, but it's high risk at the individual level that you will miss by up to 20 beats per minute. So this is important. You guys know this, but a lot of people still use these formulas, and then they don't understand why things aren't working. Now here's a typical profile. This is one of the things I want to get to is if your athlete is below their first turn point. This is actually my daughter, so this is that first turn point. You see a small increase in blood lactate at about 14 kilometers per hour on the treadmill, 1% grade. But if we look at her heart rate responses on any low intensity session, she will be a flat line. Heart rate will not drift. As long as she's well ventilated outside Norway, you're always well ventilated. As long as she's able to drink, and that heart rate will stay flat. It will not drift up. But once the athlete crosses over into threshold intensity above, we will see a cardiac drift. So this is an important physiological measure you can look at to see, is my athlete actually training at low intensity when they're supposed to be at low intensity? Is heart rate staying flat during that 90-minute run or 2-hour or 3-hour ride? And there's research to show this, that truly, if they're at low intensity, it will be talking pace. They will be able to, because ventilation will be such that they can actually have a conversation. So that's one of the kind of poor man's methods for saying, is my athlete at the right intensity? Is low, low? Once they get above threshold, then they will move into this point where they can only speak in short sentences. And when you're in the red zone, it's like, one more. They're not talking. Now we published this. This was a group of orienteers, world-class, or at least some of them were national and world-class athletes. When they trained below the first threshold for either 60 or 120 minutes, there was no difference in heart rate. There was no drift. Their blood lactate was 1.0. Their RPs were like just above sitting on the sofa. And we published this because we were interested in heart rate variability recovery, the sympathetic recovery. And what we saw was when the high-performance athletes do a low-intensity workout, they actually, their heart rate variability was above baseline within 5 minutes. They got a rebound increase in parasympathetic level. And they would say, I feel better than I did when I started. But as soon as they cross the threshold, things change. And this is one of my take-home messages for you, is that, yeah, we talk about 3 zones, and I've talked about 3 zones, but from a stress response point of view, I would almost argue that it's only 2. And it looks maybe kind of like this. Because we tend to think of these zones as very static. You put them in the lab, you've got your data, and now I know 300 watts is the threshold. That's not true. Because after 3 hours on the bike, you no longer have the same capacity that you had after 15 minutes. So the thresholds, they're in a sense moving as a function of intensity times time. And in a way, you could almost say it looks like this. So when we organize training, I'm thinking of big stress response or not. Do I want this athlete to get the stress response today, or do I want to keep them under the stress radar? And that's a pretty much, I'm dividing in two zones. Now, I may use threshold training or I may use interval training, but I know that both of them it's going to be a high stress day. Is that sensible? And the other issue is that I also know that threshold is not in stone. It moves. It doesn't move up, at least not within the workout, but it can move down within the training session as fatigue comes, as glycogen depletion occurs, and so forth. So here's 2 big problems I want you to think about that we need to get better at. One is that our standard model doesn't capture everything that's improving in an athlete over time. VO2 max stabilizes pretty quickly in the career of an endurance athlete. It doesn't keep getting better and better. And lactate threshold doesn't either. The FTP, everybody use FTP in cycling? You talk to top athletes and say, my FTP hasn't changed in 5 years, but I'm better. So our lab model is not capturing some of the important adaptations that are occurring. And the other is that we tend to think of threshold power or VO2 max as static, but they're not. They change as you fatigue during a race. It's the athlete that holds on to the highest percentage of that fresh capacity after 5 hours that tends to win races. So in my work in the coming years, I'm going to be looking at these issues. I want to quantify durability, biological durability. I want to quantify the ability of the athlete to maintain physiological equilibrium at the same external workload. And I want to quantify what we might call high-intensity repeatability, because this is what wins races, the ability to surge again and again during a long race. If you're a cyclist, in some cases, if you're a distance runner and so forth. So here's an example, and I'll use myself. I started cycling again about a year ago, and I had to realize I was too many meetings and not enough training. So I get back on the bicycle in my living room. I start using something called Zwift, which, I can race against people all over the world or train with them. And here is a 200 watt or 205 watt, just steady state ride for 220 minutes. That's 3.5 hours on my bike looking at my iPhone with some music. Well, this is heart rate. It starts at 65%. This is in December of 18. And for about 90 minutes, it is flat, flat, flat. And I'm drinking. I've got the fan. I'm doing everything. There's no sweat dripping off of me at all. So I'm doing everything right. But then, inexplicably, it just starts sucking. It starts to hurt. It doesn't feel as comfortable. 205 watts for me, my heart rate's drifting up, my legs are starting to feel. So I'm reaching this point where this was easy, but now the same workload is hard, so I'm not very durable. 6 months later, same exact workload, I'm more durable. There's less cardiac drift. Everything else is the same. This is, I think, an example of durability, and this we see in athletes. In fact, good athletes, I've got data from 5 hours, 6 hours, 7-hour rides where the relationship between heart rate and power stays the same for 7 hours. No drift. That's a high-performance elite cyclist. That ain't me. But I'm getting better, and I think we can all get better, or at least a lot of lower-level athletes, this is an issue for them to improve their durability. But they don't do enough of the low-intensity work. So if you're below the lactate threshold, this is an example for me. You have to first get to about 15 minutes so that core temperature stabilizes, and then you should not see, in a low-intensity session, you should not see drift. So this is my heart rate. I'm at just over 100 beats a minute at 200 watts for 2 hours. But as soon as at 240 watts, now I'm right around that first threshold. Now there's drift. And it's about 11% of my heart rate reserve. And that's the way I quantify it, because I take my max heart rate, my resting heart rate, and what's in between. That's a calibration that I can compare across athletes. So we're using heart rate reserve to try to get at this dissociation between external and internal workload and how it happens during workouts. We know that temperature is important. Here's a great example of a terrible situation that I see in rowing. You got the biggest bodies on the endurance spectrum, often 90 to 100 kilos, packed in a small room, pushing big watts, producing huge amounts of heat, and they're not ventilated. And they say, well, we don't ever have a workout where our heart rate stays flat. So yeah, for sure. If you're in a situation, if your athletes are hot, you're not keeping them cool and ventilated and drinking, then you won't see that flat heart rate response. But if you manage the environmental issues, get rid of that, then cardiac drift goes away until other problems emerge, like glycogen depletion. So here's a bunch of rides from a PhD student. We're looking at, I'm showing watts relative to heart rate reserve, 3-hour rides, 180 minutes for 240 watts, 63 kilo athlete. And when you do the math for each 10% segment across 3 hours, after he gets warmed up, there is zero change. He is flat. So this is what well-trained endurance athletes should look like. Flat heart rate response at low intensity. Take-home message. This is 3 hours. At the bottom, 5 hours. He finally starts to drift up after 3 hours and breaks. After 5 hours, he's hurting. 5 hours at 250 watts with zero spinning free. Which sport is this? This is a cycling event. This is power, smoothed on the bottom, raw data on the top. Which event would you say is this? It's ranging from 0 to 1,000 watts. This is a mountain bike race. This is the national championships in Czechoslovakia. This is an athlete, top 5 in the Czech Republic, and he sends me his file. So this is the national championship race. I broke it up. It's basically laps. Lap 1, 2, 3, 4. Every lap has some steep climbs, typical single track. They go out like a bat out of you-know-where, as we say in the start, because they need to get up in front because of the single track. And every lap there are surges of up to or close to 1,000 watts. And this lasts for 98 minutes. And this athlete says to me, look, you know, I'm pretty good, but my problem is I lose repeatability. My peak powers start edging down here at the end. What can I do? He's 32. I'm not sure he can do anything. But this is what we're talking about. This is a great example of high intensity repeatability. This is what wins races in many sports, is the ability to produce those surges time after time. When this athlete trains for that, what's he do? He's doing 3-minute intervals, but instead of the typical 3-minute intervals, he'll surge every interval. He's hitting 600, 800 watts at first, but what do you see as this interval session progresses? What changes? It's not the 450 watt average here, it's his ability to surge at the front end that's falling. And that's what he needs in races. That's what's losing him positions, high intensity repeatability. How do we train that? So bottom line here for me, I drew this while I was flying across Canada on a plane. I think this is the second version when I came home because it was really bumpy on the plane. But if you imagine that your average low intensity session duration is about 2 hours, which would be about right for me now. And if you think of this as dose response, so, you know, a 1 hour ride, if I'm used to 2 hours, a 1 hour ride is going to be not enough of a signal really over time to maintain my adaptive capacity. But a 2 hour ride, if I keep doing those again and again, I'm going to flatten out. I'm going to stay at that level. If I want to push my durability farther out, I'm going to need to do some longer rides. But when the rides get very long, then that low intensity session is no longer perceived as low intensity by my body. There's big stress response. Cortisol, everything goes up. So I want to find, for my athlete or for myself, about how long is going to push the, I want to push the adaptations without pushing so hard that my recovery takes so long after this low intensity session. And these are one of the ways I'm trying to look at this is using heart rate drift, using the internal physiology relative to the external workload to see how much drift can I handle or can my athlete handle when I'm trying to prescribe their low intensity sessions. So this is my bottom line to you, is that we should not abandon the physiology. We should not abandon perceived exertion. Ultimately, when our athletes get on the starting line, this is what they have. They have to be able to feel their body and how it's maintaining during a race, during a triathlon. So we have to equip our athlete with tools so that they're not just totally dependent on external feedback. They have to still be able to feel in their body, where am I in this 5-hour race? Am I at the right pace? So all three of these methods of monitoring matter. They're still part of our toolbox as coaches and scientists. I think I'll stop there. This is just, we're developing some software to try to quantify that dissociation between internal and external work so that I can give you more data on this in the future. Thank you.